welcome to another episode of the Todd and Taylor Show. I am Todd A, and you are?
I'm Taylor Trask.
And in addition to, we always talk about how we need a way to just, we never talk off air about how do we wrap up a podcast. Yeah, we should really nail down that intro, because I always feel like I pause, and then I always say something else, so you never know what the cue is going to be to say your name.
That's true. And what's funny about that is one of these times I've been meaning to throw you off by doing I'm Taylor Trask, do a question mark just to see if you notice it. Well, it's funny too, because you and I just chatted off air for an hour. It's we can't.
Yeah, ridiculous. We should have just recorded that. I don't know if you heard it. I think we've talked about Horace and Pete off air also, but Mark Maron had this great episode with Louis C.K. where he talked about Horace and Pete, and they told this story about how Louis told him about the show before it ever broadcast. They had a whole hour-long conversation, and even before they started that, Mark said, "Can I record this?" And Louis said, No, don't record it. We're keeping this secret.
Wow.
And so then when they finally do catch up, both of them are like, "We were such idiots. We should have just recorded it." And then you would have this awesome promo that runs right in the middle of the season or something. It's not like you had to air it right away to give up the secret.
Yeah.
They didn't do it. They caught up months later. So.
Well, it's always the stuff that you never intend. It's like the best the best camera for photography is the camera that's with you.
Yep.
Just the best podcast is one that you recorded.
Yeah, it's the one you remember to hit record on. I was verifying that I'd done that. So anyway, as our intro music should have told you, we are talking about our new favorite obsession, which is Stranger Things on Netflix.
And I'm just going to come out right out and say it. I said this on a previous podcast. I think it was Wednesday in Westeros. This summer of 2016 is the first time where the movie slate has been really disappointing and the TV slate has been unbelievable. I have been 10 times more excited and enthralled with what I've seen released on the TV side than I have anything that's been in the theaters up to date, up till now.
And I can even give you historical reference for that, because I went back and listened to several of our old podcasts from last year, and last year you said, you qualified it a little bit, but you said, I think Game of Thrones might be the thing that makes me start forgetting about summer movies. And
Did I say that last year?
Yeah,
Ooh.
But you weren't all in.
Mm-hmm.
And this summer during Wednesday in Westeros, you were like, I'm all in. Game of Thrones I'm anticipating Game of Thrones more than I'm anticipating summer movies.
Yeah.
And now Stranger Things, I feel exactly the same way. My weekend was, I saw Suicide Squad, and the same night started watching Stranger Things. The next day, watched 6 hours of it and finished it. And then it is Monday, and we are talking about Stranger Things. Yeah. So it totally obliterated the huge summer movie that I saw.
Yeah. Which was infinitely more expensive, I'm sure, and fraught with, you read some of the, and not that this is a Suicide Squad podcast, but you read some of the rumored, backstories and stuff, and it was just all and any political faction in the studio competing for creative control and their own vision, and it just became this muddled mess. Whereas, and I'll make this, it's pretty obvious why this sort of turn has happened. You look at Game of Thrones. You look at Game of Thrones, show run and mostly written by the same two guys who have, HBO's there in a studio capacity to make sure they're reined in, but they let those guys do their thing. Stranger Things, written and directed basically by the same two guys, they let Netflix let them do their thing. And more interesting, correct me if I'm wrong, did Netflix even tease this at all? Or did it just basically go, hey, here it is? I remember when it came out a Friday or Saturday a couple weeks ago.
Yep.
And I remember seeing one thing in Vox earlier that week going, Stranger Things is a Spielberg send-up. To the point where I thought, oh, did Steven Spielberg direct it? And that was the only thing I saw. And then it was out, and then everybody was talking about it.
Yeah, I later heard about a trailer for it. I never ended up seeing that trailer because I had that same experience. Friday it literally was a Friday. It appeared at the top of my Netflix app, and I saw the still image, read whatever totally vague description they had, saw Winona Ryder's name, and put plus my list right there. I didn't even think about it.
This is interesting for later.
And it also goes back to, just your first comment goes back to what we have talked about from, episode 0 of season 0, way long ago, a year ago, that we just love this Netflix model. And I mean, as much as we liked Game of Thrones this season, as much as it helped our podcast to have new material coming every week, Stranger Things was that perfect. It was just such a perfect package. Yeah. You know, and I know when I was like 5 episodes in, I thought, thank God I don't have to wait a week to see what happens.
You say that, but here's the interesting thing. This is the first show on any network, any bingeable show, where I definitely wanted to get to the next episode, but each episode was so packed and so immaculately like edited and set and timed that I would finish an episode. And in fact, in episode 2, this happened. Like about halfway through episode 2, Rachel, my girlfriend, comes in. And she's like, "Hey, which episode is this?" I'm like, "I don't know, 4 or 5 or something." Not even. I had to look. I'm like, Dude, "Oh God, this is still 2."
I had the same experience yesterday. When I was like on episode 4 or 5, I was thinking like, I only got like an hour left.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, holy crap, I got 4 more hours left.
And it was such where I'm like, I can stop for the night and feel perfectly satisfied and not, I want to keep going, but like I need to take a breather because this is so like literally every episode was its own movie that could have existed as like a standalone movie, like that they collected over the course of 3 years and then added it together. So I just can't. They raised the bar in so many ways with the Stan series. God. And then again, the fact. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just get a technical question out of the way. How did you watch it? Like how many days did it take you to get through it? What was your schedule of watching? When did you watch it?
I started poking at it last week. I watched the first episode with knowing that I wouldn't be able to watch anything more on Monday night and was like, "Ooh, I like this." Then I think I watched episode 2 the next night with a little of 3, and then I just finished the entire rest of it Friday. Like I'm like, I've got to like, because at that point I'm like, damn it, now I just got, because I knew if I didn't, I wouldn't have had time, and I just cruised through the rest of it, and it was just as satisfying to binge it as to not, but it was. I don't know. I just was curious that it was the whole thing. Just was this beautiful package. How about you? What was your?
Well, so I watched those 2 episodes with the friends that I saw Suicide Squad with.
Okay.
We'd been hanging out all day, and so it was much later at night when we watched Stranger Things. We started episode 3, and there was this like realization among all of us, like, if we start episode 3. We're gonna start episode 4.
We're in at that point.
And, and we've been hanging out for like 12 hours today. And 2 of the friends thought, there was a couple, and they were like, "We got to go home." And that to me was like, okay, that's my sign. I gotta go too. So I really did think I'm gonna go home, and then I'm gonna start this. It's gonna be midnight, and I'm gonna stay up until dawn watching it. Luckily, resisted that urge. So I did see the opening scene of 3.
Okay.
So then Sunday, the very next day, I had to go back yesterday and rewatch 3 and watch the next 5 hours, 6 hours.
Yeah.
So it was 2 days for me, but I do think, and for one thing, if you're listening to this podcast and your thought is, you haven't yet watched Stranger Things. We are going to spoil like we do
the ever-loving hell out of it.
The ever-loving shit out of it, yeah. But right now you're safe. Maybe we'll do a spoilers thing before we do it. I would almost suggest watch 2 episodes a night.
Yes.
You can tolerate it, or at least. The thing is, once you hit 5, it is like a roller coaster, and I don't know how you're going to stop.
Yeah.
But there was a moment like where it got really late last night when I was watching, and I thought, and I kind of wished, you know what? I know I couldn't have stopped on the last episode, but if I had stopped on the episode before that, I would have been okay. So watch maybe two a night if you want, and then you've got a freaking awesome week of like where every night you're going to watch the best sci-fi movie from the 80s you've ever seen.
Treat it like back in the 80s when your parents used to watch The Thornbirds as like a miniseries on NBC, like over the course of like 4 nights, or Roots, or like one of those things. Treat it like that. or more contemporary to those, maybe not. When Hallmark used to run their like miniseries too, like there was always
miniseries. That's such a great expression for it. Or if you're watching it, the other thing is like I do think I did start watching before the sun went down yesterday, and it was definitely creepier after the sun went down. So it was like I think that the 2 a night, maybe 3 a night, you're at least do it after after dark. Even though we'll talk about it later, one of the great creepy things about this is how creepy it is in broad daylight.
Yes.
It's not. But before I get to that, I thought, in our notes, I said it's probably best for me to lead this off because of so many things that you have talked about on our podcast. This seemed to zero in on some of your likes in such an amazing, like I was just like, well, this is just made for Taylor to watch. Like it's 80s movies. It's got all this mysterious lost kind of stuff.
Yep.
We're getting in spoiler territory here. I know at some point.
Let's just put up the disclaimer right now.
All right, here it comes.
At this point,
after this.
We'll see you later if you haven't watched it. Come on back, pick up here. But if you have watched it, or if you feel you're okay and just want to, or you're like you want to be sold on this series, keep on listening. We'll hang with us for the next however long. I'm sure we'll go.
We'll say something terrible, and then you'll go, "Oh shit!" We're gonna try. I mean, we'll talk about plot later, but we'll definitely spoil elements. And which is one of them. What I was gonna say was like, there's the monster element is very lost, kind of the like weird thing. And then to me, and I know it's all the 80s references, but there was this old joke from one of the cast of X-Files, or maybe it was even Chris Carter, where they had this joke where it's Mulder spouting. Every episode of the X-Files is Scully saying the one phrase she always said about like doubting Mulder, and then a bunch of flashlight scenes. And this did flashlight scenes in a way, like I was like, these are the greatest flashlight scenes since E.T. and Close Encounters. I mean, which were obviously touchstones. But anyway, I thought this zeroed in on your interests. Did you feel that like from the get-go, like first, as soon as the first episode started, were you like, yep, I'm in?
Well, here's the deal. So I saw that sort of article and got confused because I'm like, did Steven Spielberg direct this or produce this? Like, it wasn't clear to me. I actually had during episode 1, I had to whip open Wikipedia and be like, what is the deal with this? And once I sorted that out, I was like, oh, okay. And then I started paying attention to all the little like details, right? And you could like from episode 1, you could tell these guys are like, we love the 80s more than anybody else, and we're gonna homage the shit out of everything. Like, and I'm sure there's blog posts now that take like freeze frame stills and compare them to 80s movies and like
I've watched
and
them.
Show you like
those videos. Yeah.
I'm like, everything from like, and then even like the fact that there's the Martha Plimpton character in Barb, from Goonies, like she's in there, like everything, and the fact that the cop, and God help me, I can't remember his name in the show.
Hopper.
Cop, he's got the Indiana Jones hat more or less, like the whole like everything. You could tell that they.
He's got the Jaws hat, man.
Oh, my bad. Sorry, I knew it was some kind of Spielbergian thing, and so at first I'm like, there's this kind of weird thing in my mind where I'm like, all right, he didn't direct it. This is clearly a love letter to that entire era. Now, is it going to be too much? Is it going to be distracting? And by the end of episode 1, I'm like, nope, it is exactly perfect. They found that balance, and they filmed it like, I'm sure they labored a lot over, do we put a lot of film grain, or do we, try to put the 80s sort of vibe? And it was weird, like the texture of the, you can tell like they shot it on digital, and then they kind of, did after, they posted it in color and stuff. And there's a little bit of grain to it, but they kind of held back so that it still has a modern sensibility. Both in the color correction and then I'm getting really technical, the color correction and the editing, and like it still feels like it's made today, even though it heavily homages that time, which I really appreciated. I'm like, they could have gone 100% and been like, this is like, you could have found this in some VHS store in '84 if they had really wanted to go that way, but they held back just enough to be like, it's gonna feel like it's from them, but it's gonna have that new sheen. That I really dug, and I just dug how they found that balance, and they really delved in, and they found a balance that served the story, that wasn't just look at all these 80s references. It was like, look at this killer story that just happens to be told in this language that you're really used to.
That is, I think, the most important point. If for some reason anyone is listening who has not watched this yet, don't for a second think that this is like a bunch of in-joke, tongue-in-cheek sort of corny references to the 80s.
It's not Scary Movie. It's not that
exactly.
Genre.
And it's not that 70s show where it's like a parody of itself. This is set in like the 80s are a character in this film, like New York is a character in the Ghostbusters, the original Ghostbusters. Like this is that's just where it had to take place. I mean, and what the other thing you said was, first of all, it never goes over the line, and it keeps that tone up from the first minute to the last minute. I mean, it is just perfect. I don't understand how these guys made one movie and 4 episodes of some other show, and then they made this.
Yeah. You could tell this must, and I really want to know if this is true, but this must have been a passion project for them, where they're like, okay, this is something we want to do. And I good Lord, give Netflix all the credit in the world for finding this and I think they're twins too, the brothers who write and direct and showrun, like finding these guys, giving them the budget to do this show, which when you really think about it, the budget wasn't crazy. This was not a Game of Thrones budget show. Like if you really step back and go, okay, they're at these locations, there weren't a ton of special effects. I mean, there were some, and a lot of them are practical. And at the very, very end, you could tell they were like, oh, here's our special effects budget. But like a lot of it was very restrained, and it worked so, it literally had the same rules and constraints that any movie circa 1984 would have had.
And oh man, that's such a good point. And some of that too, I went in thinking, you know what? I bet it's gonna it's all the human stuff's gonna look great, and they're gonna get to the part where they have to have some big reveal, and it's gonna look terrible.
Yeah.
And it never did.
No.
And even in that first episode, when they see the gate, it's like that put you on notice. Like, holy shit, the stakes are huge.
Yeah.
And they're not messing around with this effects budget. It was so good. So
and they knew how to design, like whoever was their concept artist for all this stuff, like really nailed it. Like it was stuff that you really, I like your comparison to Lost, because that is, it was that sort of back before you knew what the smoke monster was, and back before you knew who Jacob was, and all that bullshit. Like there was an element in Lost where you're like, man, it's what you weren't seeing that was so compelling and interesting. And this show really milked that for as long as it could, and really sort of set that stage for like, what the hell? What is all this? Like, and it's that same thing you see in E.T. It's the same thing you see in Close Encounters, or any of those John Carpenter like scary movies. Like it was that, that just that sense of like, what could it be? Like, what, is it good? Is it bad? What is it really?
You hit on something that is a huge theme in 80s movies that was always done. You kind of guess for budget reasons, which is you're not seeing the thing that everyone's scared of, and I think Spielberg himself kind of stumbled on that formula. I know I've read interviews where he talked about in Jaws, they just couldn't afford to show you the shark all that much. Like it didn't really work very well, the mechanical one they had.
Yeah.
They couldn't do a lot of After Effects with it, so he learned to make things scary by not showing you all the details, and that carried over for certain into E.T. and Close Encounters, and this show resurrects that in such a perfect way. Like I'm going like, oh my god, the shows that could learn from this.
Yeah.
And, like Game of Thrones. I mean, for as much as we love certain episodes of it and are frustrated by other episodes, I think a lot of it centers around that. It's like what they're showing versus what they're withholding. And Stranger Things just had that perfect balance of being afraid of what you can't see.
Yeah.
But
I was going to say,
I don't even know how to get into the. Let you take it away right here.
I was just going to say, make one more point on that. The lessons for other, and the one bad thing about this is now a lot of networks or creators are going to ape this for all the wrong reasons. They're going to be like, oh, everybody. I mean, there's going to be that slew of shows now that's like, oh, but people love the 80s. Let's do that, and not really understand why that was interesting, or why this was the first show to really just do it. Like, and now it's like we hadn't seen that for so long. I really feel like what was it, 5 or 6 years ago, or maybe a little sooner than that, Kevin Spacey made this speech that's been much quoted, and you can find it on YouTube or there's any number of places you can find the speech he gave. I think it was to like the Television Critics Association or something like that, where House of Cards had just started, had just come off its first season, and he gave this spiel about like how studios and TV needs to operate, and basically summed it up by saying, bet on the creatives, like bet on the people with a vision and an understanding of the medium. And it looks like it was almost like Netflix watched that speech and went, okay, and just like pushed all its poker chips onto that speech. And like, and Netflix is the one who kind of started it all, not in the sense of these kinds of shows, but gave, HBO, for all its credit, it has ushered in these kinds of shows, and it was really good. But I think HBO was still kind of in that more conservative posture for a lot of the 2000s, whereas Netflix is like, here's your budget, here's your thing. It's almost like a record label of old, like back in the 60s and 70s, like when Mo Austin ran whatever, Warner Brothers or whatever it was. Like, it was like, go off, here's your money, go off and do your thing, and when you're done, come back and we'll market and put it out. And like that seems to be Netflix's like deal. It's like, go off and do your thing, and we'll let you know if we don't, if we disagree or something, but just bring it back. And this now if
well, I'll pick up on that, because one of the things that is so risky about HBO is, they're putting in, and let me put a huge grain of salt here, which is, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. I don't know anything about the business. I just consume it. But, they put all their money into making, say, a whole season of Game of Thrones. They make all that at once.
Yeah.
But then they release it every week. So they're almost more vulnerable to criticism.
Yep.
And last season 5 was such a perfect example of that, where tons of people just dropped off and said, fuck you, I'm never watching this again.
Yeah.
And I didn't watch it week to week after the Sansa rape occurred, as we all know, and stuff like that. So if Netflix has figured out, not only do we need to trust the creatives, but we need to put it all out so that it can all be judged as a piece.
Yes.
And not as a serialized thing. Because to me, that's what's sort of broken about the TV system is, something else we've talked about, which is, the old TV model is they might change week to week to respond to the audience, which is in itself not trusting your creatives.
Yep.
So, and we talk at length about the Image Comics model, where the creatives are in charge and they basically have to sell their books. Image is really in it to make the books.
Yeah.
And the creatives have to do everything else. And Image helps with the marketing, but they're creator-owned and creator-sold, basically.
Yeah.
And I'll throw another one in, which is FX Network. They figured this out several years ago, and that's their model for, all those sitcoms like the Louis C.K. show and
The Americans.
And I don't know too much about that one, but I know Always Sunny and like the Zach Galifianakis show that Louis C.K. is doing, Baskets and stuff like that. They say, what's your budget for the season? They like the pitch or they don't like the pitch. Mm-hmm. They give them the budget for the season, and then it's up to the creators to go hire everyone and pay out the whole season on that budget. So if Louis' show does terribly, FX is really only out, like a small budget. Like,
yeah.
But if it does well, they all benefit.
Yeah.
So it's in everyone's best interest to bet on the creatives. I love that point. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I remember that Spacey speech from years ago, but I've never watched it in full. And
oh, it's so good. Anybody listening, and you too, go when you're done listening to this, or pause this, go watch that, and you will have a whole new appreciation for Netflix's approach to Stranger Things. And you're just like, Jesus, this is literally. I imagine somewhere Kevin Spacey is like, in some, penthouse apartment with, his little Chardonnay, whatever, like watching this, or just like knowing that this came out, nodding, go, yep, see, that's what I'm talking about, there.
And so let's start jumping into specifics here. And one of the things that speaks to the point you brought up, which and what we've been talking about just now, what I love so much about this show, and what I think all, worse TV and movies can learn from it, is how every character got a piece of knowledge about the mystery.
Yep.
And the suspense was not just based on not seeing what the monster is or not knowing what's going to happen from that, but the suspense was, oh my God, all of you need to talk to each other.
Yeah, yes.
And there were such great moments where, like, you know, Jonathan confronts Nancy. Like, Jonathan doesn't believe his mother has seen this faceless creature come out of the wall. And then Nancy says something about, I saw something. And there's that moment in the school hallway where he's, you know, they're like, they keep getting closer, and it keeps getting closer on their faces as they're having this conversation. And then he's like, and it had no face. And she's like, oh my God, how'd you know that? And the chills that went down my body when they said that, because that never happens in movies and TV.
Yeah,
People always withhold information that other characters need to know, and they don't collaborate. And it's like, to me, that's not mystery. That's not suspense. Like, that's just screwing over your audience with the suspense. No?
Yeah.
Because human beings wouldn't act that way. Like, if you knew some mysterious thing and I knew some mysterious thing and they were happening together, we would go, hey, wait a second, let's compare notes on this.
Yeah.
So to me, that was such a big point. And then the other thing that I tweeted out as I was watching it, which was every single character had an arc.
Yeah.
Like, they all started in one place. They went through a change, and they ended up in another place. I mean, you might say that, like, Nancy and Mike's dad didn't have an arc, which I would accept. But even the little girl did. Like, even the girl saw some shit happen. And Mom, for certain, had an arc. That was Cara Buono, by the way, and she is awesome as Dr. Faye in Mad Men, which I wondered who that was.
I'm like, she looks so familiar. Like, who is this? And I saw her name
familiar,
in the credits.
But totally different.
Yeah.
But I mean, I just watching those kids go through stuff. I'm going, holy shit! Like, Killing Joke writers, this is a character arc.
Yes.
You know, like Game of Thrones writers, this is a character arc. Like,
and it was one that was satisfying for this story, but also it gives you so much more if they do a season 2, which is, I hate, for the umpteenth time, I'm going to go back to Carnival. There were several times watching this where I'm like, oh my God, this reminds me of Carnival. Oh my God, this is like, they treated their characters with as much care and attention and nuance that Carnival does. So that I really had a lot of sort of like, oh God, that's what I loved about Carnival. And I started kind of in my mind dissecting those things as I was, in between episodes or, even watching an episode. Just, it had that sensibility to it.
Yeah.
And you really, as an audience member, something happens in your head when that care is given to those characters.
Oh my God, yes.
It's like something and your brain shifts in that story moment where you're just like, oh man, and you don't even notice it happens, but then when it's over, you're like, why did I love this so much more? And it's really that. It is that attention and that, like, these people, for better or worse, and like you said, Mike's dad is probably the only one who, and maybe we'll learn Mike's dad's story next season. He's got, maybe he's behind it all, so, as we find out. He's the one, like, they'll do that little, like, Marvel stinger where it's like him and we'll walk into his office as like a little viral video and he'll have like all these diagrams and shit like up on the wall. I'm like, I know what happened to Elle, and he'll, he and Mike are talking about it.
In one way they were such like 80s movies parents, but again, not like in a tropey, hackneyed way or something.
Yeah.
It's like we got, like, I'm sure I'm misremembering this a little bit, but I really think that it's in 16 Candles where the dad just totally ignores Molly Ringwald. Like, he could not be more oblivious that it's her birthday, and that was almost the dad from Stranger Things.
Yeah.
And the mom, but God, I cannot remember her mom's name. I only remember Cara Buono now. But she, like, I just felt like she went through that same journey with Nancy. Like, she went on her own little journey with her daughter. Mm-hmm. It was so much more depth than 80s parents had. And honestly, I think that's what gives it a lot of its heart was that the parents and the kids went through stuff. I mean, just watching Winona just get like torn apart, or Joyce, that's her character.
Joyce, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I almost feel like a breathless talking about this.
I know. This show is like a nice like Lamborghini that we have to like walk around and touch and like not rub to, not get our fingerprints on it. And then like, then once we've like walked around it a few times, we can like open the door and gently get inside and marvel at like, ooh, ah,
Well, for more of that marveling, one of the things I do when I'm watching movies that like distracts me like crazy is especially because I think of this with our criticism of Game of Thrones, where certain moments get like, we'll criticize it like, and just nothing happened, and there really is something to that where you're trying to figure out like your brain watching, a creative piece of work. You're going, okay, is there a message in here? I mean, this is why there's so many conspiracy theories about Game of Thrones, because you're going, surely they didn't just show two characters sitting in the wilderness for 20 minutes. Like, well, what is the message here? What can we read into this?
Yeah.
And I saw the new Star Trek last weekend, which we'll talk about probably in another episode, but there were, for time's sake, to keep the movie moving briskly, there were places where you felt like, I am sure they cut out some exposition there.
Yeah.
And they kind of cover it with like, a bunch of movement and someone yelling something like, we've got to get the other, antenna up. And you're like, what? Like, why do you know you have to do that? Where you're like, when did you sit down and figure out the science behind this?
You know what? That kind of shit's starting to really bug. Maybe this is the shift for me. That shift, SHIFT, that is starting to bug me in movies now, where I'm like, this 90, and I was even talking to a screenwriter the other night. He's in California. He's actually in school to become a screenwriter. But I'm like, the 90-minute, because most movies, give or take, are 90 minutes.
Well, and I think you're getting on some, because to me, most movies nowadays are 2+ hours.
Fair enough, but that's fair enough. But
I think your point is like, if they were 90 minutes, I would forgive those things.
No, I mean that maybe. I feel like that 90-minute to 2 hour, sort of, because that's another 30 minutes when you add in credits.
Yeah.
That 90 minutes to 2 hour sort of time frame. I don't know if that's enough time to tell a story anymore, especially when you bring in like. On the rare exception is like Ex Machina, which you saw and loved, and I kicked myself for not seeing that in the theaters. Ex Machina, though, when you really look at it, could have been a killer 10-episode series on A&E or whatever, or HBO. Like, that could have been like Ex Machina. Like, what we saw as a movie almost feels like it was a supercut of what was a killer like 5-episode miniseries or something. Like, it felt like there was so much there, and what we saw was like just a glimpse at that, but that was okay because they had the space and there was just 3 characters essentially, and they could tell the story.
Well, I think there's a weird thing that shifted in the past couple decades, which is we think of a movie as like a condensed novel.
Yeah.
And in actuality, a movie is more like an expanded short story.
That's it.
Like,
ooh, you know what? That's a great
Ex Machina to me is like. It's just one of the stories you would find in an Isaac Asimov collection of sci-fi stories.
Much better way to explain it, because I'm even thinking
they expanded it to make a movie, but Stranger Things is a novel. It's like that's how long it takes to tell a novel story.
What I'm even thinking too, like, so go back to the 80s again. Back to the Future is always held up as like the perfect, one of the perfect movies. It's just like a perfect little, like everything about
screenwriting, like
everything,
like
everything, and it's an action comedy sci-fi. Like it's got, but it is itself. I think. I mean, I need to Google how long it actually is.
I bet it's barely over 90 minutes, if that.
Probably. Let me just look. It is. While I look.
I'll look for it while you say something.
While I say pontificate. 116 minutes. So
almost 2 hours. Yeah. Okay.
Almost 2 hours, but it's so perfect, and nothing feels wasted, right? Like nothing feels like, and it doesn't feel like there's all this inferred story that we never got to see. To your point, right? And I feel like 90% of the movies, action-oriented movies, whether it be Da Vinci Code or whatever, I feel like that is an increasing problem, where there's like so much story left off the table that it's like, what are we seeing? Like we have to strain suspension of disbelief so much that it's like, why couldn't you just make the movie 15 minutes longer and give us that bit?
Whereas I think why can't you make it 30 minutes shorter and not tell this other part of the like
or that works too.
To me, I mean, when I think of these big action movie pieces, Lord of the Rings are probably a good example of what I'm talking about, but Pacific Rim kind of jumps out for some reason. They always sort of have like two big battle endings.
Yeah.
It's like there's a huge battle that would have been the climax in a movie 30 years ago, and they just would have had an Act 3 afterwards. Yeah. And now it's like, no, that's just the setup. The big battle's going to happen after this.
It's interesting you compare Stranger Things to a novel, because the other thing that I kept doing the entire time, in addition to being like, oh, this reminds me of Carnival, this reminded me of like an awesome Stephen King book that I would have, and I kept.
Well, the episodes are called chapters.
Well, that too, and then obviously the font for the the title card is a Stephen King-ish font, and like there's this, but like as there was a lot of times I felt myself watching it going in my head, seeing like how it would like lay out on the page, like in novel form. I'm like, oh man, this is how this would be. And then the next thing I thought of immediately was, oh my god, give these guys freaking Dr. Sleep to adapt to a movie or TV show, because I don't trust anybody after this with that story, because they just understood. They understood like everything so well. They understood that format so well. I really want to know how those guys can't be that much older than me.
They are 32.
So they would have been, I mean, they wouldn't have been but 2 when, Back to the Future itself came out, but they would have been alive for the rest, they would have been like little kids for the rest of the 80s.
They're not 80s kids, I mean, I'm sure they knew, they were surrounded by that stuff, but I mean, when you think like, I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but I am older than they are, and I was like, I freaking remember E.T. like in the theater. There's no way these guys saw that in the theater.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, it's. Well, I mean, who cares?
Yeah. Well, let's jump back into this.
I just fell off the. This is going to happen several times discussing this, because I'm just like exhausted with how freaking genius I think it is.
I know. There's so you kind of just stop and marvel, and even. It's that Jodie Foster scene in Contact where she's like, should have sent a poet. She's just like looking at this beautiful like thing. So the you had a couple things. I mean, do you want to go through specific story points or specific characters and just call out things that you did like or didn't like? I mean, is there anything you didn't like? Because I know you have a bunch of kind of story points. I have a bunch of story points.
I know I was ambivalent at the ending as it was happening. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that was the moment where I went, oh, Taylor and I have to podcast about this as soon as possible. And I'm going to start with the ending.
Okay.
But then today, when I was reflecting on it and making our notes, I couldn't really pull that ending apart as much as I thought I would be able to. I know one of my issues was when 11 defeats the Demogorgon, and they both just sort of disappear into this cloud of dust. Mm-hmm. When that happens, Joyce and Hopper are still rescuing Will from the Upside Down, and the next scene it just cuts to him waking up in the hospital, and that really frustrated me because this show had done such a good job on the rules of everything, like how 11 opened the gate because she released so much energy that it pierced the hole, and I mean, that was like, Jesus Christ, you have like seriously come up with a physics explanation for this. It's not just sort of waved off with like, it's magic, don't worry about it.
Sure.
So that I really wanted there to be some moment where like Hopper was like Joyce, we gotta run, the gate's closing, or something.
Yeah.
Cliched as that might have been, or I really thought that like when that hole started, when she was like right confronting the Demogorgon right there, I thought a hole was gonna open up and Hopper and Joyce were gonna see it and go, oh my god, and they were gonna jump out of it, and that it was all gonna happen at once. Like 11, the Demogorgon were gonna disappear into this like extinction level event right as the other 3 came out of the gate. That was, and you were gonna, was gonna seal it up. So that was just a little frustrating technicality. That's my only nit to pick, I think.
But for me, it was such that because it was so banal, or because it was so kind of glossed over, it sort of reaffirmed the fact that nothing more happened, because everybody, we jump cut because there was nothing interesting to show you. They resuscitated him, and then they all walked through the gate, and as far as we know, the gate is still there. It's still active.
Exactly.
You know, like everything is kind of still as it was, except for Matthew Modine and that other creepy chick aren't running things over there anymore. And
I know if another frustrating point was I wish I had seen Modine get eaten. As opposed to gore and stuff that I am, and as much as I know that was probably a budget limiting thing, all we do is see the Demogorgon leap on him, and I thought, man, we just need some blood shooting up on the wall or something.
Yeah, but at the same time too, that honors that '80s thing where they don't give you all those details, right. And I think because it was budget reasons, but also just it kind of lets those kinds of stories or those kinds of sensibilities just let your own mind fill in the blanks. You know, it's like we don't need to see, and maybe in the off chance it's such that he survived. I hope not. I hope he
needs to be just dead. Gone.
He needs to be dead because they didn't mythologize him any more than that. Right? It wasn't like the Whispers character in Sense8 where they're like, this is like he's the evil genius and we're going to give you, it was very straightforward. I mean, even though those characters are very similar, the Whispers character in Sense8, if you watch Sense8, we have never talked about that.
No.
But this character too, very similar, kind of like the guy, kind of mysteriously behind the scenes, kind of responsible for a lot of the antagonistic stuff going on. But in this, they kept him pretty, like, you don't know his background. They don't reveal too much they don't humanize him really that much. He's kind of that stock, awesome 80s villain that's just like, he's kind of the personification of a bureaucracy or of a system, right?
Ugh, perfect. Such a good way to say that. Yeah, he is the personification of bureaucracy.
I think back to the guy in E.T., who it's never clear if it's like Elliot's dad or whoever the dude who shows up, once they take over their house and everything. Like, he's the kind of the main guy, but he's the only sort of agent or government agent that speaks to Elliot or to his mom. Like, that guy was very much the Matthew Modine guy, that's that character. And they even made him look like the hair and just everything. I was like, I had to look a few times going, God, that is Matthew Modine, isn't it? They really nailed the costume and the look and just the whole thing was just spot damn on.
Yeah, I mean, and what about Matthew Modine himself?
Well, yeah, 80s star Matthew Modine playing, I wonder if this is like one of those sort of dark horse kind of moments for him where everybody's like, holy shit, put him in more stuff. Like, is this going to kind of not relaunch him, but just sort of knock him a few pegs up the totem pole more? Because it's like, wow, he really pulled that off.
He was, correct me if I'm wrong, although I don't know if this is a show you watch, but I believe he is definitely not to this extreme, but he is kind of a shitty dude in Weeds. Yeah, that's definitely Matthew Modine.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like not out of his range to play this guy, but I think this just gave him such a. And you know what impressed me about the first 3 episodes was that guy's not saying a thing, and he's terrifying.
Yeah. Yep.
Like he is, like you were just like, that guy is an asshole, and I haven't even heard him say a word.
Yep. But then when he had his more, I don't want to call them sentimental moments, but more father-like moments with Eleven, there was, you kind of went and she called him Papa, and you're just like, for a moment you're like, is that really her dad? Like he kind of straddled that line where he wasn't just a complete dick. But he obviously, his intentions were unclear, but his intentions are those of that organization. It felt very bureaucratic. Like, why? It wasn't like he was some criminal mastermind he was a product of the system who just happened to be who we were interfacing with at this point in time. It's like that. And that again, going back to the 80s, that was such an 80s, early 80s thing, was like, systems are here to, control us or mess with us, and here are these characters that are these like avatars of these systems. So it's not like good versus evil in the traditional sense. It is, I'll sum it up this way: it's individuals or small groups of people, like families or friends, versus bigger, hard to quantify sort of threats.
Yeah, absolutely. That is such a great way of putting it. And of course, to me, one of the things I love that anchored it. And I'm just now putting this together with how my comment a minute ago of how they used actual physics to explain how the superpowers of 11 puncture the hole, and like that was such a good anchoring in reality, is that all the stuff that they talk about, like MK Ultra, the things that they look up as Modine's character was involved in MK Ultra, this CIA mind control experiment, and they were floating these subjects, giving them a bunch of drugs and floating them in sensory deprivation chambers and stuff like that. That's true. That happened.
Yep.
There's a program called MK Ultra where the CIA experimented with mind control.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they looked at it. Well, and they timed it just right too. Like the mom, Eleven's mom would have been old enough to have been in that. Like everything lined up so perfectly. And then they picked this like random town in Indiana, to sort of host the location for all this stuff. And you're like, that's just that. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but like that was a very 80s location, like just everything about it. Can I go through? I'm just going to tick through a couple other things that were very, very 80s. The cat, I mean, with the exception of Matthew Modine and Winona Ryder, who were 80s actors in their own rights, which was kind of hilarious to then cast them as. Other than them, I didn't recognize or know anybody else. I think everybody else was either new or was obscure enough career-wise to not really know. I don't know about the guy who played Hopper. Maybe he's on some popular show.
Is that David Harbour? Is that his name? It's like
I'm sure I'm going to get crucified. I'm like, you don't know him. He's on, whatever.
Well, I had just seen him in Suicide Squad, if I'm not mistaken.
David Harbour?
Yes, David Harbour, and it's like Harbour, but it's spelled the British way.
Oh, interesting.
He's in Suicide Squad.
But they cast these people who look like they just came out of an 80s casting call. Like, these are all the kids they didn't choose for Goonies. And they're like, well, you know what, kids, you did great. But like, they look like 80s, like the faces and the facial features are things I haven't seen since freaking 1985. And then they, they let the kids curse. Like, I mean, I bring that up specifically because I was watching Goonies, start to finish for the first time, not on TV in years. And I was struck by, I'm like, oh my God, these guys swear a lot. Like, I totally forgot that.
We talked about that,
Yeah, and it's like, here these kids are like, they're swearing a lot. I'm like, oh my God, like the kids are real kids. Like, this is what I remember growing up. Like, you go off on your bike on these adventures and your parents don't know where you're going. And, it was fine. It was kind of like, it was almost refreshing to see like life without us, without the internet and without mobile phones, and just, this is how my friends and I used to play. And I was like, oh my God, that was just seeing that like executed on screen again was really fun. And the kids, acted like they knew more than the adults, which is a very 80s thing. It's like, hey, we know, but they gave Winona Ryder, like, she was smart and she was, searching and trying to put this together in her head. So she wasn't just a hapless parent. Right. And then that kind of stuff. And then just like the Christmas lights, the fact that they went back and found, this is going to be really technical, but I can tell you definitively, those Christmas lights were 80s era Christmas lights. Because the colors, I have a strand of Christmas lights that has been with me since I was born. And if for whatever reason, it still works, and I still bust it out every year and marvel at the fact that it's 30 odd years later, it's still functioning. But there's a certain hue to those colors that were very late 70s, early 80s, that when she hangs up all those Christmas lights, I'm like, oh my God, they even got the lights correct. Like, that's awesome. And then little things like, the way when they're escaping with Elle on their bikes and the vans are chasing them, and the vans are cutting them off at different spots, and just like that threat, like just so many little things, just really, I just smiled so many times. Like, this is, God, they care. The other really cool thing was just the way that, at the end, the parents, the adult, like Hopper and Winona Ryder went off, but Jonathan and Nancy, and then eventually Steve, they had their part to play. And it wasn't like, they independently figured out what to do. And it wasn't like, we need our parents to help us. It's like, we're just going to do it. We're just going to do it and hope everybody else is cool doing what they're going to do. And it wasn't like they had to all sit around and get Ocean's 11 and talk about it and plan it out. It's like, you go do your thing. We got to help too. That was cool. You haven't seen that for a while. Like, all these little story beats and character beats.
Part of that too was I just loved Hopper taking control.
Yes.
He did, and like, the scene on the bus where the agents descend on the bus.
Yeah.
I don't really know that I knew that's what was going to happen at that moment. Like, when I thought there's a couple ways out for the kids when they're on the bus and the agents sort of surround the bus and they see the bikes under the bus, and I thought, oh, they're going to go, hey, they ditched their bikes here, and they're going to turn the other direction looking for them. I didn't think like they're going to walk on the bus. So when the agent walks on the bus and then he gets knocked out, obviously I knew it was Hopper at that moment, but the idea of someone going rogue fully like that is another thing that just doesn't happen in movies and TV. We get tons of stuff where someone goes, I got a plan that might work. Trust me. Yeah. And they don't tell you what the plan is, but then everyone has to go do it. It literally just happened in Star Trek Beyond for me last week. And Hopper was like, no, I think I know what's going to work. And he just brings like one person with him, and they just go rogue and do it.
Well, and he's like, and he believed early on. He wasn't like one of those characters walking around going, I don't know, this seems pretty fishy to me. Like he was.
But it was so believable how he came around. Like it was like so evidence-based.
And he went, I mean, he just cut to the chase and freaking went to the facility and broke in and was like, what the hell? Like it wasn't like one of those things where they had to save the reveal of the gate till the very end. Or it was like, he was there. Like, and they tried to silence him once, and that didn't work.
And honestly, I thought all of that was totally realistic. Like when he breaks into the facility, I like this story kept coming back into my head that a friend of mine told me, who's an attorney, who was telling me about this. He was telling me the story about this other attorney defending a nun who went to protest the Oak Ridge nuclear facility, and she walked past all of their security.
Wow.
And so they tried to charge her with all these crazy violations of terrorism and stuff like that. And so the attorney who defended her gave this presentation on all this, and he was explaining what the real failure was. Like their security failed at every single level.
So,
they let an unarmed nun, she didn't break in or anything. Like all these charges of breaking and entering are just bullshit. So that story was fresh in my head. I'm like, holy crap, I think that happened in the 80s or 90s or something. And so to have a guy just sort of in the 80s when we didn't have all this RFID stuff and the metal detector at the doorway and things like that, he could just walk into a government building. I mean, that's not unbelievable. It's just unbelievable when you try to put it in a current context of you can't even walk into an airport without having to stand in line and go through something.
I wonder how that played for kids born post 9/11.
Right.
I wonder if they looked at that.
That unrealistic.
Do they look at it and go, that what? Because I would imagine every single person, our age or older would be would agree. Would be like, oh my God, that exactly right. We should get some youngins in here to I would love to interview somebody who grew up, was born, let's just say 1995 or later, who has no physical connection to the 80s at all.
Right.
Do they? Because they would have been 6 when 9/11 happened, so they would have had a world context to sort of experience the world. And after that, would they look at this and just be like, kids never, kids don't play that way? And what? Would it just seem like this fantasy world that wouldn't make sense to them? Or would they recognize? Or is the show so well done, all that just logically lines up for them?
Or God help us, would they be like, that's what my parents talked about?
Yeah.
And you and I were like, oh, Jesus Christ. It wasn't even your parents' age. It was just 4 years earlier.
Well, and they did this thing too with Hopper where they're like, they allude to the fact that he was he was a PI or whatever it was earlier.
Well, only briefly they mention.
But they don't make
a cop in the big city.
Yeah, and they don't make it stupid. They don't bang you over the head with it. Be like, right. Remember, he was a PI. It happened. So when he starts to get more, aggressive with the investigation, it wasn't entirely like, oh well, what, And even if they didn't say it, it would still have made sense. But it was one little extra detail that just helped my rationalizing his character.
I like hearing you say that, because I didn't really. To me, when they said that, I worried oh no, are we going to get some backstory about he was this hard drinking cop in the city and all he could get was but they didn't do that.
No.
It just gave you enough context to why he would be so tenacious about investigating these little things that didn't add up.
And and they give other little details he and Winona Ryder had a thing at one point, and
then they tie that back in when he has a thing with the librarian too, and you're like, oh yeah, this guy gets around.
And then, then you find out why that might be. When they flash back to his daughter, you're like, oh my God, just all the little details.
I know. Talk about character arcs. That guy, the way they filled in the details of that guy's life and showed him opening up more and stuff. It was oh my God, I can't believe you've taken the heartless cop bureaucrat from an 80s movie and made him into this guy that I'm like, oh, I just want to buy you a beer, man. Like,
you want to see a whole show of just him go around solving mysteries and shit.
Hopper.
And then they put a big old question mark over his head again when he gets in that car at the very end. The only thing about the ending that threw me, and it wasn't even a bad sort of throw me, but it was like, what? Is when he gets in that car, and I thought, oh, he's gone until season 2, and we'll find out more later. But then he's back, like the very next scene, he's back. You're like,
so he makes some deal with them.
Like, what the hell? Well, I think he made the deal when he was in the prison. When he
made the deal.
He made a deal, and I think the deal was with that woman. He was like, I'll let you.
Yeah, let us go, and we'll never speak of this. But we've got to rescue this kid out of the Upside Down.
But I think on top of that was, and I will. Or maybe it was just assumed like, hey, if we make it back alive, I have to basically be your, I'm going to work with you guys to help. Or maybe he didn't say that. Maybe it was simply the car rolls up, because at that point, Matthew Modine, that other woman, like all of the leadership are gone. So maybe the organization was like, hey, you came back alive. We need to debrief you. It could have been as simple as that.
It didn't have to be. It definitely felt sinister. They don't say a word to him. They just open the door and he knows he's got to get in.
Yeah. So I feel like there was another deal. I think he made a deal off screen that we'll see later. Because remember too, he what did he say? And it was weird because he basically threw 11 under the bus to get that deal. But then at the end, he's like leaving food for her in the box, or that's what I meant to take away from. So like, what was that about? I mean, you had that in the notes.
I was going to ask you. We're
talking about the box.
He goes in the woods. You know what? Man, I didn't even think about this. But, well, no. We're pretty sure that Joyce and Hopper came out the way they went in. Which, if they went through the gate where they entered, that would be the one that's in the Hawkins laboratory.
I have no reason to believe otherwise, and the fact they didn't show us.
They would not have gone through the tree gate that Nancy went into in the woods, which would be near that box.
Correct.
But I just think there's something significant about him going back into Mirkwood and leaving it there.
Yeah.
Like that's the area where he would leave it.
Yeah.
That's Elle's area. But can I point out one little thing, and then we should talk about Mirkwood and D&D and stuff.
Yeah.
Because you and I have talked about this before, so I think we'll find it funny, which is when he drives up to the facility and there's like the chain link fence, and he sweet talks his way in with the guard, which I think was amazing. Like, what a use of tact. We never see small town cops with tact.
Yeah.
Like, there was nothing where he just gets out, and it's funny too because there are times where he didn't use any tact. He just punched somebody in the face. But it was like perfect. It was like, yeah, this guy knows, like that was such he wasn't lying to the government agent at all. He was saying, I got the press hounding me. I got a mayor who's panicked. I got a mother who's torn up. I know the kid's not in there. Give me 15 minutes. Yeah. It was like, that is exactly what a local cop needs to say.
Yeah.
It was so great. But anyway, what I wanted to mention was when they're looking through that gate, like through the chain link fence, and you just see the sort of, like personality-free, like, stone building in the background. It just looks like poured cement. It's like there's no architecture or anything.
Yeah.
I swear it was an homage to Jesse Ventura's first episode of his conspiracy theory show where he's yelling at the HARP building in Alaska.
I did not see it. I saw that show. I didn't see that episode.
I thought because when you and I talked about the Denver airport, I thought we also talked about the
did, but I don't think I saw that episode. I think you just explained it to me, and I need to go back and watch it. But
it's just so funny because he doesn't get in. They don't let him in, so there's just a shot of him outside the chain link fence yelling at it. Give me the answers.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, at this juncture, I wouldn't be surprised on any reference or homage they worked their way in. I mean, I'm sure that people will be combing over the show for years to come, like the Shining, where they're like, this is what he really meant. Like it has a lot of that. And then a lot of that turns out to be, well, no, he didn't really mean that. But I guess if you want to pretend, sure. Like there's going to be a room, was it 309 or whatever that documentary is about The Shining? I feel like there will be a Stranger Thing version of that as more people like delve into it and, you know, look at the details and like infer stuff that, you know, probably wasn't intentional, but you know, is there a board game on a shelf in some cutaway shot that was like, this is an homage to Stanley Kubrick and when he, you know, blah blah blah. You know, is there that level? I guess we'll never know.
In that supercut I saw of references, speaking of Kubrick, they did a side by side of Joyce swinging the axe at the wall and Nicholson swinging the axe in The Shining.
Nice.
Shot from the same angle, you know. But it was, so alongside those homages or the sort of cinematic winks to stuff like that, there was the language with which they talked, like the Demogorgon and Mirkwood, all of that. How did you feel about it?
Well, I mean, it was. I mean, kids in the 80s, I didn't, but a lot of kids in the 80s would play D&D. Like, you know, I remember like in small towns like that, especially kids who are nerdy. I mean, and it was clear these kids are, well, wait, I was one of those kids too. But like, it was clear these kids, you know, they were, their science teacher really appreciated them.
Yeah.
You know, he gave them that kind of.
Teacher was so good.
And it was like, and that was like, there were teachers in my school too who were like, if they recognized initiative or, you know, just sort of interest in something, would let you go into the AV room and just kind of hang out and do whatever. Like that. There was a lot of that sort of like, this was a time that I don't know exists for a lot of kids now.
It's true. Like kids, we didn't have cops at school. Nobody came and shot everybody.
Yeah, and and just the fact that teachers like, yeah, you guys can hang out in here, and you know, when we get a new piece of gear, it's like you guys got to check this out. And so where was I going with that though? There was
well, we were talking about. I mean, I brought up the question of like Mirkwood and the
So it's
like the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit references.
I mean, it made sense. That would have been something that would have happened then. But it did this cool trick where now all of a sudden you don't need to know much about the woods. I mean, they call it Mirkwood, and it's like they give these little triggers now. You're like, oh man, like I don't care if I even never see it. Like I know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Like they created a language both visually but also just actual language that really they didn't have to waste a lot of time. Like they didn't have to be always like sweeping shots of the forest and like, you know, they just could say, oh, that's Mirkwood. It's like, okay, I know exactly. And more importantly, I know how these kids see the world, right? Like I can see the story through their eyes way more clearly and be in the world through their eyes more so than just a viewer. Like they really figured out how to do that quickly. And it was just, you know, God.
Yeah. And I think it also communicated to us and our age in that way of like, we know what they're, I mean, this is exactly what you said, I know, but in that way of like, we could speak that language. It was like a coded language that we knew, you know? I mean, when they open the D&D, like when he opens his Trapper Keeper's 3-ring binder, he's looking at the frickin' Dungeons and Dragons guide that I have in my parents' house.
Nice.
Like the blue one. And but the Mirkwood and all that stuff, I'll take you back here. When we talked about The Martian last year, we both laughed at the Council of Elrond reference that they make in that. And it was such a funny moment in that movie of, hey, we're all nerds here. Of course, that's what we're going to call it. You know? Yeah. But I think in this, in Stranger Things, it wasn't even a joke at the nerds' expense, even if it's at their own expense. These were not jokes about Tolkien or Dungeons and Dragons. It was the language of the kids, and it just perfect. Oh, it was just so cool. It was like gave them their own little coded language that we can translate because we understand that world. You know.
Yep.
Yeah.
A couple other things I want to bring up before if we run out of time or I forget. Barb. My only other critique that I think, if this even could be a critique, is yes, they needed somebody to be pulled through to the Upside Down and for that person to either die or be seriously injured, so we understood the threat of what was there. Like if that hadn't happened, I would have had a problem because it would have been like, well, what was really, would Will have even been hurt? So the fact that they show Barb, you know, they show what happens to her, but there wasn't a lot of, you know, Nancy was the only one who really seemed to give a shit. And then even once they pull Will out, there really isn't. There's not like the funeral for Barb. There isn't like the like her parents like sobbing, or there isn't any of that. Like what? You could argue, well, she wasn't that important, but I think she kind of was. I mean, they set her up. They kind of make her this important sort of MacGuffin character that gives us a lot of information and sets things in motion. So I would have loved to see just a little bit more like, oh, and the school could have like a or even Will to be like, it's so sad she didn't make it, or something, some kind of recognition of her effort.
They could. I agree with that. There could have been some mourning at the end as they were wrapping things up. But in their defense, I'll say one of the things I thought was so impressive about the show, which another thing we forget in sort of contemporary ways that people tell stories, is that they did a really great job of saying, things like, "I'm sorry I was a dick to you yesterday."
Yeah. Okay.
And you really got the feeling that like this all happened in 5 days.
Yeah. Well, but then they do say a month later, right? So it's like they cut to Christmas.
But only at the end, I mean,
like
I know when they were pulling Will out, I thought, yeah, if you haven't eaten for 5 days, like it wasn't sort of, there was no magical aspect to it. It wasn't like he'd been off in space for a month and then it was like, no, this kid has just been in some weird other world, not being fed for 5 days.
That's true.
So he can survive, but he's in rough shape.
Yeah.
It wasn't. I remember when they pulled him out and had him in the hospital. It was like so realistic to me that no, of course they don't pull the tube out of his stomach and he's like, where am I? And he just walks out of the upside down with him. It's like, no, this kid has not eaten. Like he's got to be in the hospital just not to be dehydrated.
It's exactly what it would have been. Like, well, Mom, I'm so glad to see you. And it's like,
yeah, I know. That's like any movie that would have happened. Like they pull him out of the rubble and like the demon corpses around him, and he's like, "Oh, thank God you made it!" And like,
yeah.
Let me get on my scooter. And
again, it was a very 70s, 80s thing for there to be stakes and real stakes and real shit happens to real people. Like that's all, And again, that should be the lesson people take away from this. Not, oh, everybody loves the 80s. Let's just do that.
Right.
Ad nauseum. It's like no. Real kids, real stuff happening to real characters on real, like that's the point.
Real
here.
stakes, real character arcs, real growth.
Set that
and you can put it in any era.
Put that on the moon in the year 3000, and it would be compelling. Like, don't think this is.
You are exactly right.
Don't think that's what this is. Like, and my guess is the first thing that's going to happen in light of this is it NBC who owned the rights to Erie, Indiana? They're going to reboot that shit. Just you wait. We're going to see, like, for the mid-season replacement, like, the NBC will be like, we're bringing back Erie, Indiana. And it's like, oh, God. And, like, that's going to be the lesson that's learned. And maybe it'll be okay, but it's... I love that show at the time. Don't get me wrong. But, like, it does not need to... That's not the answer here. That's not the solution.
It shouldn't be a shock, given that most of my weekend revolved around Stranger Things. It should not be a shock to me that I have heard Erie, Indiana mentioned twice in 3 days.
Yeah, I mean, there are parallels. There are parallels.
So weird to me that name would come back.
I would say
a show I've not thought about in a long time.
Indiana is the OG version of Stranger Things in that it came in like 90, 91, and it was kind of the first show to go look back and deliberately, kind of show you some of that 80s, 70s, 80s stuff that you loved in a show. I think I would be surprised if we were to do a podcast then, a lot of the same kind of themes and stuff we'd be talking about. Although it was not, I'm not saying they're the same kind of show, but it, a lot of the stylistic stuff they were doing was very homage-y, if you will. I would say the other thing that was interesting to me was Steve. So you have this like cliche 80s villain boyfriend who then does this really unexpected turnaround. I did not see. The villain boyfriend from Goonies didn't have a change of heart, and like there's not that. They were really setting this up to be he's an asshole, he's one-dimensional. Yeah. You're not going to see him again after he gets the shit beat out of him, and then she's going to end up with Jonathan. And then that didn't happen. You're like, oh my God, wow.
Another great argument for why the 80s, they can't just redo the 80s to capitalize on this.
Yes.
Because in the 80s, that guy was two-dimensional.
Yeah.
And in this show, he had growth.
Yes, he had a lot of growth.
He had a character arc,
and at the end,
and it was totally believable, and we liked him all the more for it.
And to the point where, well, at the end when he's, when Nancy kisses Jonathan, but then goes back in and sits beside Steve, you're like, oh, you weren't like, what? I mean, it made sense. It was
human. Yeah.
And you're like, well, of course, a month later, this is probably what would have happened. Like he, he decided to not be a total, like if anything, his friends remain the one. It's almost like he passed it on to them and they remain the one-dimensional 80s villain, high schoolers. And he, he went on a different journey. It was kind of like, okay, and it was,
we'll have to put this in the show notes too. There's this awesome YouTuber who did a short video on how Daniel is the real bully in Karate Kid. And the dude is right on.
Wow.
Like, it's like Cobra Kai doesn't throw the first punch.
Yeah.
Like, they bully the kid a little bit, but he's the one that starts fucking things. Like, Daniel is the one that goes and, like, I don't remember what he does. He smashes their beatbox or something on the beach, or he does something to them on their, like, little beach cookout, because like, these guys are mean. And it's like, man, those, because I tweeted something last night when I was watching about there's a standoff between Steve and the other guy in his gang.
Yeah.
And I tweeted something about the Cobra Kai in this like standoff. Really, was like one of the best things, because you see in that moment of like Steve going like, man, I was a super asshole to her.
Yeah, yeah.
It was, and even that scene in between where he goes to clean the paint off of the theater is like, man, that guy just grew up, like in a serious way. That was so great. I could not believe that he was not eaten by the Demogorgon, but I'm glad he wasn't, because that would have almost been a throwaway if he'd shown up at the house and then been the one killed.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm glad they went that way. Are you saying, by the way, that Daniel is the Walter White of Karate Kid? Is that really is Karate Kid just an early OG version of Breaking Bad? Because I make the same argument. You look at every interaction in Breaking Bad, with the exception of maybe Tuco. After Tuco on, everything that happens is Walt's fault. Like, Gus Fring is an okay guy until Walt starts fucking with his shit, and like, he's the reason. Walt is the reason everything goes so horribly wrong, because like he just can't leave it alone. And I'm like, as you're describing Daniel, I'm like, oh my god, I need to go back and I need to revisit Karate Kid. I might look at it in a whole different light now.
It's amazing. We'll put that link in the show notes for sure.
One other big thing I want to get at, and then I think that will be the end of my list.
Let's wrap it. Yeah.
And it's the most important kind of takeaway from this. This story is multifaceted. It's wonderful. It's got all these character arcs. But what they did that I never saw coming, that after they did it, I was like, you clever bastards. They totally pulled a Bridge to Terabithia on us. And if you know that story, Bridge to Terabithia is one of my favorite stories of all time. The original 80s, kind of crappy 80s movie I still like. The remake I liked, even though it was more, fantastical. It's a story about this boy, kind of this, very similar to Mike in Stranger Things, who meets this girl who like kind of expands his perception about life and really makes him love life. And, they go and she makes him like use his imagination and see things in this wonderful way. And then she dies in Bridge to Terabithia. She's taken away, and he has to go and figure out how to live without his best friend. And this girl who's like showing him everything. And it wasn't like romantic, sexualized kind of stuff. It was more like just a young, little boy and a little girl who become friends. And like, it's this amazing story. Stranger Things totally does that. The Mike L relationship is that. This boy meets this girl, and it's like, and they have a little bit, there's like a little kiss they share and stuff, but like, it's basically like this girl like makes this boy see life in this whole new way, and he impacts her too, and then she's suddenly gone, and like, how does he have to, like, I'm like, I can't. And you can almost think the whole show is almost about that relationship at the end of the day. Yeah, they're trying to find Will. Yeah, they're trying to do all these other things, but that relationship is the story. Like that, especially for season 1. Like, you look at that arc, I was, when that clicked in my head, I just was like, I almost cried. I'm like, you guys totally.
Yeah, I almost cried a couple times in this. You've set up my final point perfectly, which is, I'll tell you why this whole thing works, Taylor. It's because it's about love.
Interesting.
Those boys learn like oh my God, I'm like gonna tear up just talking about it. They figure out friendship and love in that little 4 or 5 day adventure. When Lucas goes and apologizes to 11, like that, my heart breaks just thinking about that.
Yeah, that's true.
All the little stuff when they're mean to 11, but then Mike's still like, he's like, I know I'm just being temporarily mean to you. I'm just angry in the moment. It's like these kids were more grown up than grown-ups we see on television these days.
Yeah.
And then the way that like Nancy's mom, like Nancy does that great 80s girl, rebellious girl thing of like throwing in her mom's face like, I slept with him, is that what you want to know? But then it's like 2 days later her mom is like, oh my God, my daughter has been through some scary shit. She forgives her and she loves her. And that moment in the school where 11 is like destroying the Demogorgon and the kids realize that that's it, like right even before she says goodbye, Mike, like just watching those boys, like their hearts break.
Yep.
And of course Joyce through the whole thing is just driven by her love for her son.
Yeah.
And Hopper for his daughter.
Well, and
I could just keep going on. This thing was about love.
That sentiment is the reason. Was it episode 2 or episode 3 where Peter Gabriel's cover of Heroes played?
Oh my God!
And Jonathan and Joyce had that. They embraced.
That was the first one where I was about to start crying.
I mean, that was really when Jonathan and his mom like kind of reconnected in a way that we've never seen before. And it was like, that's the use of that song. And the only reason I know it's Peter Gabriel is because he did a whole album of covers that were like symphonic covers called Scratch My Back. And I think the artist who he covered then did their own album called And I'll Scratch Yours, where they covered Peter Gabriel's songs. So David Bowie does, I forget which song of Peter Gabriel, and on and on. It was a really cool kind of concept, but that was the fact that they had an 80s artist singing another 80s artist song with a modern song. Like that whole moment really was that if you're going to pick one moment out of this entire show that's like, why does the show work? It's that ending sequence. That was just so amazing on every level. And you're right. That whole sequence was about the love and the discovery of love and how it forwards these characters. Like that's exactly, you nailed it.
And that's why we care about them. Their motivations are totally pure. Nobody is being a hero to be a hero. Nobody is necessarily like even the bad guy, like he doesn't have just some vague bad plan.
Yeah.
I mean, like you pointed out, he's that character of the faceless bureaucracy, but even then it's not like what we see in modern day storytelling where there's just like an evil guy at the top of the bureaucracy or corporation. It's like, no, there was kind of a mission here, and he's tender with 11 when he
I'm gonna say
holds her head in his hands, and I think there was a real relationship there. I mean, he seems kind of like a psychopath or something, but it was there were moments where you're like, there's something here, but just that theme of like everyone's motivation and everyone's drive.
Yeah, I'll argue that Brenner was proud of 11. Like he was proud of what she was able to do, which is why he kept pushing her. He's like,
almost everything he said to her was incredible. I mean, and I know there's I know what he means, but it is praise. And I'm not trying to give him more credit for like, oh, the abusive dad said some nice things.
He's like a Japanese tiger mom gone wrong, right? He's like that, strict, like you're gonna succeed and achieve. But then when like the kid does, he's like he's intensely proud of her. He's like, and granted, his motives for her might be completely off. In some other, who knows? Are they creating a super soldier? What are they doing? But in the meantime, like, and even when he's like, today's the day you're going to make contact, he's like, I'll be right here. He tells her a lot of the same things Joyce tells her when they put her in the makeshift pool later on.
Well, and not to humanize him too much, because I just love the portrayal of him. But you've reminded me of something, which is I think their motivations, the researchers' motivations, came from something very impure. Like let's figure out how to mind control people. Let's figure out how to have them control other people's minds. Let's have them figure out how to spy on our enemies. Let's have them figure out how to kill our enemies. And then something happens where he realizes 11 has literally ripped a hole in the dimension, and he almost approaches it like a scientist.
And at
that point, he's not totally. I mean, granted, they only have like 2 adventures in it before stuff really gets fucking crazy. But before she creates a gate. Mm-hmm. But yeah, one of them is she goes up to this Russian and is able to talk, to hear him talking, and they're able to get some spy secrets. But then once they realize there's this creature there, the Demogorgon, it's more of like a scientific mission. At least a little bit of that.
No, I
don't want to give him too much credit, but he did feel like, no, we've got to explore this. You go touch the creature. Like, you're the one that can make contact, and that's when everything goes crazy. But I don't think at that moment he was necessarily thinking of her as a weapon. He was like, it was an inquisitive kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm going to point out one other reference because I think it's so worth noting, and I forgot about it earlier, which is the second chapter is called The Weirdo on Maple Street, and I never figured out if there was actually a Maple Street in this. But there is an old Twilight Zone episode, it might even be season 1, called The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, and you should just go watch that. It's so good. And I'm sure that that's a intentional reference.
Interesting.
So
interesting.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, we could go on for another.
I know we could. When I texted Taylor about this today, I was like, "Hey, how about we not talk about Suicide Squad and Star Trek, and we just do Stranger Things?" And Taylor's response was like, "I can talk about that for hours."
Yeah, there was no way we're going to cover anything else. I think you summed it up perfectly in terms of why it works, and just and it's one of those shows where I feel like we'd be doing it a disservice to get into any more specific, storylines or anything, because it's just you just got to experience it. You just got to go watch it and experience it. And let's talk about season 2. There's obviously going to be one. This was, I think, other than House.
Do we know that for sure?
Oh God, this is, by all accounts, this is either the most popular thing they've ever released, or in the top 3 with season 1 of House of Cards and whatever. It's definitely the most popular thing they've released in the last 2 years. So that there wouldn't be a season 2 would be shocking. It may be, maybe a year or 2 before we get one. Yeah. They ended it in such a way that normally I like to play that game. What will season 2 be? And put the outline in my head and try to figure out how they'll move the pieces around. I have 2 theories, based on what we saw. Theory 1, and you look at the title of the show. It's not, these things happen to these people in Indiana. It's Stranger Things. What's the other thing that the 80s was really good at? It was this anthology way of storytelling. What was Amazing Stories? Wasn't that Spielberg's other thing that came out? What if season 2 happens to an entirely different group of people in an entirely different part of the country? And at some point, maybe Will or Hopper interact with that other group to tie it together, because it's going to have to tie together at some point. But maybe the Upside Down is infecting another part of the country, and we get to see a whole other group of stories. And they do that 2 or 3 more times, and then various characters from various seasons all unite somehow, or we see how they all impact each other.
I'm so glad you mentioned that anthology thing, because I literally said that to a coworker today. I don't necessarily want it to pick up where this one left off. I almost want them to just tell a different Stranger Thing.
Yeah.
And exactly what you said. Maybe it ties into this.
Yeah.
And I didn't see the Cloverfield, the 10 Cloverfield Lane or whatever. So I don't really know. But maybe that I was initially felt pretty positive about let's set something else in that universe.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily like a sequel.
10 Cloverfield Lane is less in universe than it is. There is thematically connective tissue, but it's.
Gotcha.
Having seen it, I could not say how they would make those 2 movies somehow sequentially match it. I think it's just more, hey, this is like a Stephen King book. I mean, in some Dark Tower way, I'm sure you can make them connect. But I'm thinking Stranger Things season 2 is maybe 2 years later, and it's in another part of the country. I feel like that's where this would go, because I just don't see what you do. I mean, they got rid of Matthew Modine. They got rid of that. If that woman had lived, I would have been his henchwoman. I would have been well, clearly there's more tissue here, but I just don't see the only thing that we have to see more of is, I mean, in my mind, Mike and Elle have to reunite somehow.
But does that kind of spoil it if Eleven is still out there? I mean,
yes, I think
I liked her being the state. I didn't want her by any means to die or disappear or anything, but I felt like, well, that's the sacrifice that has to be made. It's
what if we flash? But the fact that Hopper's leaving food for what I assume is her at the very end. What if we flash forward like 3 or 4 years and she's got a full head of hair and she's like in her late teens or whatever, or mid-teens or whatever, and she's like just this homeless girl on the run who can do cool things and knows, she's got more vocabulary and she's just like this older girl now who can like do, like we follow her on this like journeyman story for a while. Oh
my God, what if she is Furiosa?
Yeah. There are so many things to do, and like I just feel like that would be the most satisfying way they go with it. If they keep it in this world with these kids, I feel like Will's involvement is much more sinister than I think we think now. If they're going to keep it in this world, he's got to be, through either his, some kind of mind control or just like, why is he hiding these slugs from his mom, right? Assuming that he's coughing these up more than once. Like what is happening? Is he like the new Avatar for the Upside Down to like invade our world, right? Like, is he some kind of like, and are we going to follow that? And,
he's Bishop, man.
Yeah. Is there something more there? And then
he's come back with the alien inside him.
Yeah, seriously. Like, is that, and then, cause like we didn't see, this wasn't Will's story, right?
Right.
Season 1. Like it was all about getting him back, but it wasn't his story. It was basically Mike's story. Mike and then, Nancy and her friends. So it's like, what do you do with him in season 2? He was kind of one-dimensional. You build him out a little bit more, maybe, but you make him kind of he's the cause of everything going wrong. And then the question becomes, does he go back to the Upside Down? Is he not? Is he only temporarily savable? Is there, explore that a little bit more. But I really, really hope they start season 2 in a different place, different people, 5 years later or whatever you want to do. I just think that homages that sensibility. It calls out, all those cool, is it Amazing Stories or Amazing? Is that the Spielberg thing that he did? Amazing Stories.
That's the one that sounds familiar. I'm sorry I didn't go look it up after you said that, but
no, it is Amazing.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was like a series. And honestly, I thought when I first heard about Stranger Things, I thought that's what they were going to do, where every episode was going to be kind of a different deal. So the fact that they didn't do that makes me go, well, maybe every season will be a different deal. I love these actors, but I want to see, let's see what other actors can do. Like let's see when we expand that world, what we can get. Like I just don't know what you do with Winona Ryder after this. She gave her all, right? Like what else do you give her to do? That's just not a repeat of what she did in season 1.
I agree, and that's totally that's why I just hope it's not like a sequel to it, because it's sort of, especially for nobody else, like Joyce went through so much, like I don't want to see her get torn apart like that again. That was
or like we don't need to see like Nancy's mom go through the same thing. Like it's not, it's just, we don't need that. Like is there like a Donnie Darko story that can be season 2? Like that's what we can hope for. Like it starts and basically shows us Donnie Darko, where it's like, what the, what? And maybe there's like a kid, or some kind of connective tissue. I do think the way Elle disappears, she's got to come back in some way, shape, or form. So that's the only thing I can think of.
I definitely think the Eggo waffles were there to give us hope. There was a reason that they were, in clear cellophane and not there was like a box of something that he put in there, and then these waffles. So obviously there was some, and maybe he was just being a sensitive guy. I don't know, but that box was interesting.
Yeah. So. Anyway, let's wrap it up. I think that's everything we could say.
Yeah, and I realized that I made a reference to Bishop, thinking of the alien's character that came back with the alien inside him. I don't think I named the right character. That's because I'm a poor Alien fanboy and have not watched it lately.
Well, I didn't call you on it, so I'm just.
I know, but we got to explain this. We can't stem the tide of angry comments that come my way.
Yeah, fair enough.
So, anyway, where can people find you and us?
Yeah, so we are online in all kinds of places and soon to be more places. Currently, toddandtaylor.com. Find us on SoundCloud, find us on iTunes, Pocket Cast, wherever you want to get your podcast. Google Play, everything. Yeah. We've got more domains and more cool stuff coming soon.
It would totally help us out for you to subscribe to us on one of those channels, whether it's through your Pocket Cast or Stitcher or Podbean or any of these other podcast listening things, or if you just go straight to the source at SoundCloud, which we have been told by friends and fans that is their favorite way to listen to us. Yep. You can find all of this. Just go to toddandtaylor.com and you'll find links to SoundCloud. Subscribe to us there. I had a further thing to say about the which is feel free to comment on these episodes because they're all on SoundCloud, and I've noticed that we from time to time get like a one-off kind of comment, but that's definitely, I think, the place where discussion can happen. If you want to call me out for naming the wrong Aliens character or something.
I always get private messages or texts or stuff. It's like, put those out for the world to see. Challenge us, agree with us, whatever you want to say.
Yeah, for a while we were putting these on my blog, and then we sort of transitioned once we got the feeds up and running. It's like, dude, it's all on iTunes, Google Play, and all that stuff. So SoundCloud, I think, is the home of comments if you want to make it so. Anyway, so plug yourself.
That's right. And I am at Taylor Trask on Twitter.
And I am at HeyToddA on Twitter. Awesome. And you can also continue the discussion with us on Twitter. That's where we talk about stuff and talk to each other about these episodes.
That's right. Chime in, tag us if you don't even know us. Tag us, we'll tag you back. Let's chat about this and more. And if you want to hear more episodes like this where we cover a show or a movie, let us know. Give us suggestions.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, we would love to hear what we should do next. We don't even know, so we can't tease it, but we know we've got more cool stuff coming. So join us next time.
That's right. We'll see you guys later.
Later.